October 12th, 1972. The day the journey began. A small airplane took off from Uruguay. The plane was heading to Santiago, the capital of Chile. On board was a tall, powerful rugby team, full of young athletes. In total, there were 45 people on board. Some of them were family members and friends of the players. It wasn't meant to be a long journey. Under normal circumstances, the flight from Uruguay to Santiago would take just 3 hours. However, the flight path took them straight toward the towering Andes Mountains. Stretching across South America, the Andes form the longest mountain range on Earth, towering over the land below. What seemed like beautiful scenery would soon become a deadly challenge for the travelers. On October 12th, a storm in the mountains forced the plane to stop its journey and land in Mendoza, Argentina. The next day, on October 13th, the plane took off again at 2:18 p.m. With clear skies above them, the plane flew smoothly for the next hour without any trouble. At 3:21 p.m., the pilot began descending. The plane seemed close to Santiago, but it was still over the mountains. Because of the towering peaks near the city, severe turbulence suddenly hit, and the aircraft started to shake violently. At that moment, clouds surrounded the plane. As soon as it emerged from the clouds, the pilot realized they were heading straight toward a massive cliff. The pilot couldn't gain altitude, and the rear of the plane struck the mountain. The entire back section tore away from the aircraft. Everything inside the plane was destroyed. The cockpit was completely shattered, and the pilots were killed instantly. It came to rest scattered across an unknown mountain in the Andes at an altitude of 3,570 meters. Amazingly, out of the 45 people on board, 33 were still alive. Their terrifying fight to stay alive had only just begun. This is the heartbreaking story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571.
An old transport plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. 45 persons were aboard, given up for dead.
Survival fascinates people.
All of the passengers were given up for dead.
It became known as the Miracle of the Andes.
In the aftermath of the crash, 2 young men, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, escaped with only minor injuries. As medical students, they rushed to help the wounded. Many passengers were badly hurt. Among them was 23-year-old Fernando Parado, lying unconscious after suffering a fractured skull. The 2 medical students did everything they could to help the survivors. At the same time, less than an hour after the aircraft vanished, Chile's air search and rescue teams were alerted. 4 helicopters were sent out to look for survivors. They flew from sunset into the night, desperately trying to locate the crash site, but came up empty-handed. After listening to radio transmissions, rescue officials concluded that the plane must have crashed in a remote and difficult-to-reach area. The problem was that the plane was white and had crashed in an area covered with snow and ice. Spotting it in those snowy mountains was extremely difficult. On the night of October 13th, the survivors held on to hope, believing that if they could endure the freezing night and protect themselves from the cold, rescuers would arrive the next morning. 5 badly injured passengers lost their lives during that freezing, snow-filled night. The number of survivors dropped to 28. The survivors turned the plane's wreckage into a makeshift shelter against the cold. Using suitcases, torn seats, and packed snow, they sealed the open back of the aircraft to trap heat inside. The next day, October 14th, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay began search operations, but they were unable to locate the crash site. The survivors tried to write the word SOS on the roof of the plane using lipstick, but they quickly realized they didn't have enough to finish all the letters. Then they tried to form a large cross in the snow using suitcases so that search planes flying overhead could spot them. But they soon realized this method wasn't working. That day, 3 aircraft passed above them. The survivors screamed and waved desperately, trying to catch attention, but no one noticed. Another day passed. On October 15th, the survivors came to a frightening realization. They desperately needed water to survive. One of the passengers, Fito Strauch, discovered a way to secure water for the group. Using a metal sheet to concentrate the sun's rays, he melted the snow, letting the water drip into empty wine bottles from the group. In addition, many passengers repurposed seat cushions to protect their feet from the snow and cold. On October 16th, 3 days after the crash, Fernando Parrado finally emerged from his coma. Coming from coastal regions, most of the passengers had never experienced snow before. And there they were, somehow still alive, enduring minus 30 degrees Celsius at high altitude without adequate food or water. On October 21st, 8 days after the crash, the search teams gave up. They believed that since they hadn't found any signs of survivors in 8 days, continuing the search would be pointless. Meanwhile, the survivors found a transistor radio among the wreckage. Harley, a rugby player, was interested in electronics. He carefully attempted to power up the radio, and after some effort, it finally came to life. However, the radio worked only one way. They could receive broadcasts but had no way to communicate back. After 11 days, they learned through the radio that the search operation had been called off. Their hearts sank, crushed by despair.
Feeling that their world is alive and they consider you dead.
Fernando Parrado was the only one who remained calm upon hearing the news, for he had a different plan brewing in his mind. By the 11th day, the survivors' supplies were running out. Their entire food supply consisted of just 8 chocolate bars, a can of clams, 3 small jars of jam, a jar of almonds, a box of peanuts, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. A few days after the crash, the survivors started carefully rationing the limited food they had. Every day they ate very little. Parrado survived for 3 days on just 1 chocolate-covered peanut. Just a single peanut. At an altitude of 3,800 meters, there were no trees, no plants, and no animals to provide food. By the 11th day, their food was completely gone. In desperation, some ate parts of the plane, the cotton and leather from the seats, but it only made most of them ill. Under these brutal conditions, with starvation closing in, the survivors made a choice that would shock the entire world. To survive, they had no choice but to eat the frozen bodies of their friends and family. It was not an easy choice, as most of the deceased were friends, classmates, or close family members.
We have to eat, and the only proteins are the dead bodies of the people that were in display.
Since Conza had suggested the idea, he was the first to try it. The others tried to resist, but after 2 days, with no other choice for survival, they finally resorted to eating human flesh as well. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, this food source was also quickly running out. That same night, while trying to sleep, they heard a loud noise. A sudden avalanche had struck the area. A torrent of snow thundered down from the peak, engulfing the wreckage. Several survivors were trapped and suffocated beneath it. In the end, only 19 survived the avalanche.
Said, Roberto, you had it. You're going to die. That's it. A very nice sensation of heat between my legs because I was peeing on myself and saying, that's it.
The 19 survivors were confined to a tiny pocket beneath the snow, struggling to stay alive. Gerardo took a metal rod and poked a hole through the snow, allowing a little air to circulate. After 2 days of hard work, they dug a tunnel under the snow and, with great effort, managed to reach the surface. They realized that no one was coming to rescue them, and to survive, they had to take action themselves. The strongest among them, Cansa, Parado, and Vicentin, took it upon themselves to explore the surrounding mountains in search of help. They were given more food and warmer clothes. Their first priority was to figure out exactly where they were. Before the crash, the co-pilot mentioned that they had flown over Curacao. They reasoned that by walking a few kilometers to the west, they would eventually come across rural settlements in Chile. But their estimate was terribly wrong. In fact, the crash site was 89 kilometers to the east. When they didn't reach a conclusion, they returned and rested for a few days to regain their energy. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the three of them set out again. After hours of trekking eastward, they finally came across the rear section of the wrecked plane. Inside, they discovered a large number of suitcases. They found boxes of chocolate, 3 cans of meat, a bottle of rum, spare clothes, some comic books, and a few medicines. They also found a 2-way radio. A radio that could not only receive incoming communications, but also transmit messages. They concluded that no matter what, they had to get the radio working. That way, they would be able to send out an SOS call. They pulled several batteries from the aircraft and attempted to get the radio working. But they were unsuccessful. They concluded that to survive, they would have to keep moving west. By December 11th, 59 days after the crash, another avalanche struck. 3 additional survivors lost their lives. Only 16 people remained.
I was trapped completely by the snow in the avalanche, and it's the most deadly silence you may imagine. I couldn't move.
In order to ascend the western mountains, they had to sleep through the night to regain strength. But how could they endure the bitter nights at minus 30 degrees Celsius? One of the survivors was an 18-year-old boy called Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. He remembered that his mother had taught him how to sew with a needle. He had brought along his needles and sewing supplies. He came up with the idea of stitching a sleeping bag out of scraps of clothing.
I had the idea that with the insulation you could make a sleeping bag, but I not only had the idea, I made it myself.
The next day, December 12th, 2 months had passed since the crash. These 3 brave men, Parado, Cansa, and Vicentin, set out to climb the glacier without any mountaineering equipment. The only place they could be sure lay to the west was Chile. They believed they were only a few kilometers away and could reach their destination in 2 or 3 days of walking.
And you can imagine, without any skill, without any training, you're like a child when you are confronted with a snow slope. You try to go straight up, you might be using your hands and your feet, you're slipping, you're sliding, and for every step that you go up, you slide back a half a step.
Parado, to protect himself from the cold, Parado layered 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over his t-shirt, and 4 pairs of socks on his feet, even covering them with a plastic shopping bag for extra protection. They set out with no technical gear at all, no map, no compass, and no mountaineering experience. At such heights, the air thins and oxygen becomes scarce, but despite this, they pressed on. climbing toward the mountain's peak. Gradually, they made their way forward. Through the first, second, and third days, and into the morning of the fourth, it became clear that their estimate had been gravely mistaken. The path ahead seemed endless. With limited food supplies, Visintin chose to go back to the crash site, leaving only the other two to push forward, reducing the amount of food they would need. On December 15th, Visintin began his return, which was easier because the entire route was downhill. He used a plain seat as a sled to slide down. In just an hour, he made it back to the crash site. While it had taken 3 grueling days to climb the mountain, he made it back to the crash site in just an hour. After 3 grueling hours, they finally reached the mountain's peak. As far as the eye could see, it was all mountains.
I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak, I couldn't even think, because what we saw was horrible. Instead of green valleys, we saw mountains and snow-covered peaks 360 degrees around us, to the horizon all around us.
Then, suddenly, Parado noticed something different. On the western horizon, 2 distant peaks free of snow. Believing that was the right direction, Parado and Kansa trekked for many days, until at last they arrived at a valley where a river flowed freely. Finally, after 9 days of walking on December 20th, they saw some cows on a farm and realized humans were nearby. They were beyond exhausted, too weak to take another step. And then, at that exact moment, across the rushing river, they saw them, 3 men on horseback. Parado screamed with everything he had left, but the river was wide, roaring between them, swallowing his voice before it could reach the other side. But by sheer chance, one of them spotted Parado and Kansa and shouted a single word, "Tomorrow!" The next day, the horseman returned. But this time, he came carrying paper and a pencil. He tied the paper and pencil to a stone with a string and hurled it across the river. For the first time, Parado was able to send his message to the world. Parado wrote in Spanish, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. I have been walking for 10 days. My injured friends are still at the crash site. They desperately need help, and I don't know how to reach anyone. We have no food. We are weak. We can no longer walk. Please help us. Where are we?" The man who caught the message was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. He read the note carefully, then raised his arms and signaled that he understood. After speaking with his 2 companions, fragments of memory surfaced. Months earlier, they had heard reports of a missing plane. When the truth struck them, they were stunned. Without wasting time, they rode west to seek help. When they finally reached the nearest town, the military authorities were alerted, and word was sent all the way to Army headquarters in Santiago. Meanwhile, the farmers put Parado and Kansa on horseback and took them to Los Matines, where they could finally get some rest. It was later discovered that in just 10 days they had trekked 61 kilometers across the mountains. The moment the story reached the world, it exploded into international headlines.
We have film of what very nearly amounts to a real miracle. Survivors of a plane crash in the Chilean Andes. The plane went down 10 weeks ago. The 45 people aboard were given...
¿Pudieron sobrevivir ustedes? ¿De qué se alimentaban? Bueno, sobre ese tema... Sí.
The Chilean Air Force wasted no time. 3 helicopters were launched at once to rescue the survivors. Meanwhile, the army questioned Parado and Kansa, piecing together details about the crash site. With Parado's guidance, the army commanders finally pinpointed the location of the survivors. On December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, 2 helicopters finally reached the site. 16 survivors were pulled to safety. They were in horrific condition, battling altitude sickness, dehydration, broken bones, and severe malnutrition. Yet against all odds, every single one recovered. This story became a lesson to the world of hope, resilience, and the power to survive when everything seems impossible. If you enjoyed this story, you can find many more real-life disaster and survival stories on my channel. Subscribe to support the channel, and don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.